It's a real pleasure to be here. I really appreciate what you do to get the stories out to people and how important our history is. I am currently the Judge Matthew J. Perry, Distinguished Professor of History at Clemson University. I retired at the University of Illinois at Champaign-Urbana, where I was Distinguished University Teacher and Scholar for 34 years.
Hello and welcome to Obehi Podcast. I'm your host, Obehi Ewafo, and I strongly believe that everyone has a story to share. Now let's get started into this episode.
And have worked a lot on race relations, the American South, and I just completed a book that came out in 2021 called Justice Deferred, Race in the Supreme Court, which is the history of, in fact, race in the United States before there was a constitution, really even before that we became a nation or a country, right through the nomination of Amy Coney Barrett in 2021. And I use the Supreme Court as a lens to look at the history of race in the United States to get a long overview of it. And I will just say this to begin with. It's a little embarrassing because in the title of my book, Justice Deferred, Race in the Supreme Court, I use the word race. But we all know there's no thing as race. Any geneticist will tell you that race is nothing. There is one human race. Minor differences make no difference at all. You know, whether you study the genome or genetics, there is only the human race. Or to sort of paraphrase Abraham Lincoln, as my ancient faith and as my mother taught me, we're all created in the image of God, so we're all the same. And yet we have this distinction of race that was created as a legal distinction by the courts in the United States, reaffirmed again and again by the Supreme Court until very late. In fact, one of the cases, probably the main case that we'll discuss a little bit today, was led by Reverend Joseph A. Delaine, who fought against segregation. And it is his case out of the small community, Somerton in Clarendon, South Carolina, the laws in the United States. It was the first case, first of all, in the federal courts to declare that separate but equal was wrong. And then it went to the Supreme Court. And though it was renamed Brown, I no longer say Brown v. Board, but I say Briggs v. Elliott Slice Brown v. Board, because this was the case that was argued by the great civil rights attorney, Thurgood Marshall, that really changed America. It brought about then the basis not only of the end of segregation. That's not to say we ever had integration. We really haven't had it very much, but it ended the laws that upheld segregation and discrimination and became the basis of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which gave rights to all people, whether gay, lesbian, Native Americans, Latinx, or old people like me. It's the basis of non-discrimination that came with the 1964 Civil Rights Act, just 10 years after the Briggs v. Elliott / Brown.
This is an interesting series that we are considering, which is about the life and legacy. And today, of course, we are talking about Reverend Joseph A. Delaine. We're going to understand who he was, what he did, and why it is important for people to remember him in a time like this, both in the United States and, of course, among people of African descent or whoever cares about having a fair state. So to give us a kind of a background, how would you describe this individual? Who was he?
He was a very smart man and one of the most courageous people of all time. He was an AME, African Methodist Episcopal Church minister. He was a school teacher. He was a landowner and farmer all down in this very rural community. As Thurgood Marshall said when he went to Thurgood Marshall to get him to argue the case and get the NAACP to take on the case, that he was afraid they would not be able to fundraise for Reverend Delaine and his plaintiffs because no heard of Clarendon County or Summerton, South Carolina. And even today, people are unaware of this story. And it is the focus of it all. It really begins there. And it is that case that is argued that becomes a unanimous decision in what we call Brown v. Board, but should have been called Briggs v. Elliott. And here's one of the most interesting things to me is that it all started over gas for a school bus. Black children had to walk some as many as 7 miles one way, 7 miles back, other further. No school buses to get to these very, very, very run-down, one-room schoolhouses, no toilets except outside, nowhere equal to what the white schools were, which were very, very nice in the county. But not only that, buses. There were a lot of buses that picked up all the white children, rode right by the black children who were often taunted by the white children in the buses as they walked to school. It was also dangerous with flooding and rivers that people had to cross. The black children had to walk to school. There were could be floods and dangerous streams for them to cross, all of these sort of things. So initially, the African American parents petitioned and asked the school board for buses for the black children. The school board said no. They had about 27 or 28 for white children. They wouldn't do it. So the black parents got together, bought their own bus, and then they asked only for gas for the bus. And the white school board again refused and said no. And I've often thought, if they had not been so determined in their white privilege to deny opportunities for black children to ride in a bus and had just given them gas for a bus, we may not have had the famous 1954, what we call Brown v. Board, I call Briggs v. Elliott, Brown v. Board decision. And it also shows, I think, just how much white privilege, white supremacy, the laws that were there of segregation influenced how white people think about things.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, that clarification is very important. So, of course, it helps us understand that at the time that we are talking about here, it's not as if the state didn't have the resources, not that there were no buses. They just didn't want to give to the other member of the community who they feel are not welcome, who they feel should not be there, who they feel for one reason or the other just needed to be discriminated against. Because if they could give 28 buses to white children, there is no reason why they shouldn't give the same to the black children. In fact, they just did it to punish people for, I don't understand. So they be setting up this discrimination in a kind of a loop that is continuously coming again and again and again. And even though they have the resources to be able to do something right, they just didn't do it.
And that is repeated over and over and over. And I think it's a good time. This is the first illustration in Justice Deferred. Can you see it? Does it show up for you?
Yeah. We can see it.
That is the great Thurgood Marshall getting off the train, the Silver Meteor, coming down from New York City, where he worked with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund to argue the Briggs v. Elliott case in Charleston, South Carolina. And I put a quote with the picture that I wanted in the book, and I think it speaks to what this segregation and the laws of segregation and discrimination and the ways they kept, of course, black people from voting to have an influence to be able to elect people that would represent them. And this is, in fact, what he said soon at that time. And I think it's so relevant because people think of the civil rights movement. Many see this as the real beginning of the civil rights movement. Rosa Parks said, these incredible parents and children and Reverend Delaine was what inspired her in the Montgomery bus boycott a few years later. So here's what Thurgood Marshall said. Sometimes I get awfully tired of trying to save the white man's soul. And I like to remind people that the civil rights movement was not just about Black people, but it was also about white people. What did it do to white children to think they had the right to ride in a bus by Black children walking 10 miles, maybe, throw things at them, spit at them, whatever? What gave them that? What was that doing to their souls, as Thurgood Marshall said? That their belief in their privileged place in our society. So Thurgood Marshall and the Briggs v. Elliott plaintiffs, Reverend Delaine, and all of those were literally there to save the soul of America. And I think that's what they did, at least for a long time. I'm worried about the soul of America again, but certainly this was a major turning point in the civil rights movement, in the courts. And it's a wonderful story, except for one thing we forget. These people were never, ever rewarded in their time. They lost almost everything. I'll give you a quick example. People know about Brown v. Board, so there's been a lot of celebration of Reverend Brown in Topeka, Kansas, that the case is named after. And if we have time, we can talk about speculation as to why the case did not remain Briggs v. Elliott, because it was the first case, and alphabetically it should become first. And that's normally how those things happen, in a case being named instead of Brown v. Board. But in Kansas, in Topeka, Kansas, the only schools that were segregated were the elementary schools. High schools were already, in fact, integrated. And Black children who were teenagers went to school with white children at the one school. However, there was no school. In fact, a lot of places in the South, there were not even high schools at all. But that was not the case. And in Topeka, Kansas, there was one man who signed who was a plaintiff, and that's Reverend Brown. The rest were all women. And the reason is pretty clear. That is, the women were not employed outside the home and couldn't be fired. And Reverend Brown, of course, preached to a Black church, so he was independent of white control. The opposite is in Clarendon. They had so many people sign petitions to be plaintiffs, 180 something, husbands and wives. It was family, even children signed and tried to be. And instead of a statue to them to celebrate their heroic actions that changed America for the better, many of them lost their jobs. There's an implication, at least, that one person died, maybe murdered. We don't have hard evidence. Like the main plaintiff, Harry Briggs, who had been a World War II veteran in the Navy, had to leave Clarendon County and go get work in Florida. And even there ran into problems. And this is what happened to everyone. When they brought this case, and even before they brought this case, whites cut off their credit, whereas Black and white farmers used to share equipment no more. They couldn't get seed to plant or hay for their animals. It was a total boycott. Many literally were losing everything, and many did lose everything. One of the most interesting things about Reverend Delaine, they burned his house. The church moved him to a community a little further away. The defense attorney for the county, Clarendon, was also a recruiter for the White Citizens Council. For those you know what the White Citizens Council is.
Now, what can we learn about his early childhood? Where was he born? How did he grow up? Tell us about his early childhood. People want to know about that.
Yeah, he grew up in this area, Clarendon, South Carolina. When he was young, he had to, in fact, escape South Carolina when some white boys attacked his sister, were going to sexually abuse her. And even though he wasn't a large young man, he was just a teenager. He fought them off and hurt them. And then the white father complained. So he had to actually leave and go away, or he would have been in bad trouble. And then comes back. I believe his father had been a minister as well. He is college educated, on scholarships, and he is an active leader. It is the community that is pushing for this rights for their children and education. In fact, the NAACP was only looking at ending segregation in schools, in graduate schools, looking at graduate education. So this was a huge shift. And Thurgood Marshall was very reluctant to take the case. He just thought that these people would not be able to withstand the pressure. Instead, they were amazing. And then there's a great story. There's a picture in my book of that as well, when Thurgood Marshall is arguing the case in the federal court, where Judge Waddy's Waring, who's actually comes out of an old aristocratic family. His nephew is a big segregationist, is the editor of the Charleston paper, that's a leader in massive resistance and all of these things. But Waddy's Waring was doing some great rulings, equalization of the pay for black and white teachers. He ruled against the white primary, on and on and on. And he becomes a champion of equal justice under the law. So when, in fact, Thurgood Marshall goes in, they're only arguing for equal. That is, they want equal opportunity, not to end segregation. At which point, this white aristocratic judge says to Thurgood Marshall, who they got to know each other over the years of Thurgood Marshall arguing in court, says, "Why don't you go for the whole ball of wax?" He says, "Challenge segregation and the laws of discrimination that is the root of this evil in the South." And he says, "Because I will be one of the 3 judge panels that hears this case, it will go straight to the Supreme Court." So when Thurgood Marshall met with about 180 of these people, most of them from Reverend Delaine's church or throughout the community, and he thought, of course, they would say, we're too afraid to do that. And then they said to him, "We've been waiting for you to get there. We're ready. Let's go." And they stood up to all this, though they lost. It's not like it's a heroic thing. They lost their land. They lost their jobs. As I said, at least one probably lost. And Reverend Delaine, who had both his house burned down and his church also burned down. And it was after the AME church, he did not want to leave. They tried to get him to leave and go somewhere else. He fought them, but he went to a nearby place, Fort Mill, where...
But there is something I want to ask them.
Sure.
These people that are burning down the churches, their houses, did they ever get punishment for what they did, or they are just free to do whatever they like, as long as who they are punishing are the African American people?
They were never punished for this. And this is one of the most interesting stories I want to tell you about. Well, think about it. This is another court case that we can talk about later. Juries decided if someone was guilty or not. So it would be an all-white jury, and no all-white jury ever found white people guilty. And when I talked about Judge Waring, Waddy's Waring, he presided over a trial before this, and at least some people think this is where he began to change. I think he'd already changed, as he says in about a 10,000-page oral history at Columbia University, that as he read the law, he came to be taught by the law, coming from Augusta, Georgia, and he was going to see his mother in South Carolina, and a bunch of other veterans there, and they were sort of celebrated, and he did not take guff from a white bus driver, and he said he needed to go use a restroom. When he got off, the white bus driver went and got the sheriff, and the sheriff blinded him with billy clubs. They beat him up and blinded him. So it goes to court, and Judge Waring is the judge, and he sees the injustice. He knows that this sheriff is guilty. The all-white jury decides within 15 minutes or so that he's innocent. Judge Waring would not even let them come back because he just saw how horrible it was. He went for a walk, he came, and they found him innocent. This case is the Isaac Woodard case. The famous H.G. Wells, the producer and the radio show, the TV star. It became a call celebrity, and it got, in fact, all the way uh, to President Truman, who this is what really infuriated him and helped him bring about a study on civil rights to integrate the services and all that. That's just an example of how people get away with things. So what happens with Reverend Delaine? The person who was the judge was the attorney who was defending the white school board against integration, literally was a recruiter for the White Citizens Council, this group who would boycott whites and were standing against the civil rights movement, not the Klan, but very similar. So he went to the new place that Reverend Delaine was now the minister and told them, you have that blankety blank, using the N word, that caused all this trouble, that's bringing all this on. So they were shooting at his home. He just stirred up the Klan type people to shoot at his home and all. So he goes to the police and tells them about it, and they tell him to mark the car. Back when President, in the early 20th century, there had been a postmaster appointed, an African American postmaster for Lake City, is where this occurred. And they burned his house, and they killed not only him, but his 2-year-old daughter in his hands. Got completely away with it. And so he got, what happened to the postmaster? The same thing's going to happen to you and your family. So when he told the police, he said, what should I do? They said, mark the car. So when they came by shooting at his home, Reverend Delaine took his gun, shot back, and they ran away. A black who worked in the sheriff's office came and warned him, they're coming to get you. They swore out a warrant, not for him self-defense, but attempted murder. He had to get out of South Carolina in a dramatic escape, and then got his way to New York City, where he stayed. And this is a tragedy. He loved South Carolina so much that he moved back to Charlotte. And when he died in the 1970s, there was still a warrant out for his arrest for attempted murder. Now, that's been removed since, but that shows you what I'm saying, that these people were never recognized, never got the sort of recognition for their change of America for the better. They were also persecuted, as were their children, or was their wife. His wife and he were fired from their jobs. But that is hard for people to imagine what it was like, and the bravery of these people, what they went through for their children, just if their children could have the right first to ride a bus to school, and then to have a school that was not a dilapidated building where desks were, some of them were just boards over barrels, asking for that. And then finally, after Judge Waring sort of convinced Thurgood Marshall to end segregation, and it was found unconstitutional, basically overturning the old laws of Plessy v. Ferguson, which said separate but equal was okay.
So it basically means that the state, in this sense, the United States or regions of it, whoever might be controlling the law and the policy system, were encouraging the abuse of the African American people. That you could kill them, you could do whatever you like to them, nothing will happen to you. And the reason a lot are made is to correct wrongdoing, because none of us is perfect. I understand it. But when somebody do what is wrong, the law is supposed to correct it. But if there is this law that are made uh, for some people, for example, I can't even. I find it very difficult to even fathom what they are thinking. So, because you are a white person, according to the definition of white people by the Common Convention, I find it. What do you think they are thinking? That a group of people gather together and they beat up an innocent person, and this case is charged to court in a lawful state, that crime is considered nothing. Nobody is punished. I think that is calling for a repetition of that incident to happen again and again and nothing, there will be no consequence. What are they thinking about that?
Well, you're absolutely right, and it's interesting because the one of the Supreme Court justices really changed that. The Warren Court is the court that we think of, that I grew up with, that ended segregation, gave us the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, but it begins earlier. And it's because of this. It is because, in fact, the first case is the Scottsboro boys, these young men accused of rape of two white girls on a train. It's been shown they were innocent, but they were prosecuted and convicted and put on death row. And this was the first case, but there were a lot of others. There was a judge, Judge Charles Evan Hughes, Judge Charles Evan Hughes. And, I went to Princeton for my graduate work, and Woodrow Wilson was president of Princeton, a college professor there, and we were sort of thought, and he was one of the great, despite his having segregated the civil government in Washington, D.C., and segregated it, he was considered one of the most progressive presidents, and one of the people he ran for president was Charles Evan Hughes, who was a corporate lawyer. But just like Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln was a railroad lawyer. There was more to him than this. His father had been an American Baptist preacher in upstate New York who had immigrated to the United States. And the American Baptists are very different than were the Southern Baptists. They were the school that founded or gave the money to help so many black colleges like Morehouse College. They were very good on race. And all these years, what happened was when, in fact, a black person was convicted of murder or death, then it would go to the Supreme Court, and then the Supreme Court would look and say, well, the South Carolina Supreme Court or the Oklahoma Supreme Court said that this was race neutral. No law said that this was to keep black people off the rolls, so then they couldn't be on the jury. And then you get Charles Evan Hughes. You can see why I, as a historian, loved him. For the first time, it was said, he said, I'd like to see the evidence. And when he saw the evidence, there it was very clearly. They had doctored the voting rolls. They had written down, like not supposed to, that this was N or C for a, quote, colored voter. And that is when the law started changing that lead to this Brown v. Board, that we got literally laws of equal justice under the law. And the great example I give of this is Charles Evan Hughes. Again, it was Woodrow Wilson who had segregated the federal government in Washington, D.C. So they had just moved into the new Supreme Court building, beautiful building. And they had a cafeteria. And some black people came in to eat, but the guard stopped them. And so then the guard told Charles Evan Hughes, okay, the guard said black people were trying to eat in the restaurant, but I stopped them. You don't have to worry. I kept them out. So Justice Hughes took him. He said, come with me. He took him outside. He had him turn around and said, look at what's written over the front door where you enter the Supreme Court. He said, can you read that out loud for me? And he said, equal justice under the law. And Hughes said to him, if you cannot enforce equal justice under the law, then I think you better get another job, at which point the Supreme Court restaurant was from then on desegregated and was integrated. And that was Hughes who set up in motion, I think, all of these cases when during the Warren Court, where you're looking at evidence, that this is our hope, that the evidence can show what is happening. It's the Briggs v. Elliott case in Clarendon, tried in Charleston, where the famous doll experiments were, where social scientists had black and white children look at dolls, and they'd all say, including the black child, the white doll is the good doll. The black doll is the naughty or bad, to show how segregation had hurt the psyches of both black and white people. So it's such an important case. And these people need to be celebrated. I have argued again and again, we need a statue of Reverend Delaine on the State House grounds in South Carolina. If you go to the State House grounds in South Carolina, all you will see are statues of individuals, that of a person, or people who were either slave owners, Confederate generals fighting for slavery, or literally supported segregation, including none other than one of the greatest politicians, and I would guess he could be called a statesman, James F. Burns. Burns had been a congressman, became a senator. He was called the Cardinal Richelieu of the Senate. He was so powerful. He was a good friend of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who really wanted him to be his vice president instead of Harry Truman. But he appointed instead Burns to the Supreme Court. And that may be the reason that the case is so often referred to as Brown instead of Briggs v. Elliott, because there is at least some evidence and a lot of suspicion that it was the influence of the former Supreme Court judge called Jimmy Burns that got the case renamed, and not for the only deep South state where the 5 consolidated cases became.
Yeah, I want to ask you a question about that. When you say evidence, does it mean that the cases that were judged before, where maybe, for example, white people were not punished for the crime they committed against black people, it was lack of evidence presented before the judges, or they just simply didn't want to uphold the Constitution or the law, as it were?
Yeah, well, in fact, the evidence often was not presented. Even in local communities, who are you going to get to defend these black plaintiffs? One case right before Thurgood Marshall made the quote I gave you about sometimes I get tired of saving the white man's soul. He was almost lynched in Florida, but he saved 3 people who would have been lynched and who had been put on were being convicted by using the evidence. In fact, I love to say about Thurgood Marshall, he won against all odds in these Supreme Court cases, arguing exactly using the evidence to show how injustice was being done in the former Confederate states and the South in the United States. And after he becomes Supreme Court justice, having won when nobody thought he could win, arguing before the Supreme Court, he's on the losing side most of the time as the court changes, and it's not as sympathetic to black rights. But what would happen is something like this. In Arkansas, there was a riot, but the riots were white killing black people. But instead, they arrested black people and had them being tried and convicted of rioting and sentenced either to lifetime in jail or being killed, until Justice Hughes, it went to the Supreme Court, and Hughes said, I want to see the evidence you convinced them on, because the only thing that they had were they were black and not white, and you had an all-white jury. So Judge Hughes says, I want to see the evidence. And what he saw was, when he asked for these things, is that they had marked on the registration list whether somebody was colored or black, as they called them at the time, and white, and had all white juries. And so it was clear that it was not random, that race was involved in this, and they were able to stop the execution of these people who had been accused in the Arkansas. They called it a massacre, but as I said, the massacre was whites killing blacks because black people were protesting for their rights as tenant farmers and things. And then white started gunning them down, and they were trying to fight back. So that is one example, but again and again and again, this kind of things happened. And we talked about Isaac Twitter, that was never appealed, you see, but and this is where I think we have hope today. We can show evidence to judges, then they have to follow the law, or they should follow the law. And if the law says you cannot discriminate on the basis of race, that is, that you cannot keep black people off the jury pool. See, one of the things that worked was disfranchisement. And it's interesting because the NAACP LDF had really fought for the franchise, that is, for black people having the right to vote, more than working toward desegregation or even equal schools. But because they won in Briggs v. Elliott, people always think, oh, it was always about just getting rid of segregation. But they understood very clearly how critical the vote was to citizenship. It focuses on everything. It is the base of everything. I think about when they were trying uh, to get anti-lynching legislation passed. It finally just passed a year or so ago to say that lynching is a crime and you can't lynch people. And Southern congressmen would break it. One of my great heroes, and someone I'd like for us to talk about sometime, Dr. Benjamin Mays, the longtime president of Morehouse College and the mentor of many, many black leaders, particularly men, and particularly known as being the mentor to Martin Luther King Jr., who he convinced that you could be a minister instead of an attorney and still do things for the black community. And he said, this is what Mays said, give us the vote and we can take care of the anti-lynching law. We don't need it. But black people did not have a seat at the table as long as they didn't have a vote. It would be all white. It would be not only all white jurors, but only white people elected to public office. The school board in Clarendon, South Carolina was all white, though black people were paying taxes just like.
There were also black people in that community where the white people are there deciding their fate, right?
Yes, that is right. They decided the school board was all white. So they decided not to give gas, not to give a bus. And so if black people could have voted and had a meaningful vote that counted, they could have had someone on the school board to argue for them, and maybe even, as I remember, it might have been a black majority county even.
Is it possible that somebody could have influenced him in following the trajectory that he followed?
Mm-hmm.
Like, did any person help him to go to that direction? Did he learn from somebody? Who can you sort of speak of in terms of who could have influenced him?
Well, there were two college professors he had as an undergraduate student and, studying theology, the ministry, who really influenced him. But people forget about the short time period. He knew about the time when African Americans did vote, when they did elect representatives, sheriffs, and even legislators, and had about 6 or 7 congressmen from South Carolina. So those people were also heroes he'd been told about by his own parents. And a lot of people, we forget how that we sort of compress our history and that people don't remember it. But in the African American tradition, it was there of black activism, and that black people had voted, and until the segregation laws in South Carolina, when Ben Tillman was elected governor and then senator and put in the laws to segregate, black schools, even though they were still segregated, actually got an equal amount of money per student as did whites. But with the laws of segregation, once they were in, they did not. University of South Carolina was desegregated during Reconstruction. Black students went to the University of South Carolina. So you had this history of activism that never really ended. We tend to think of it, that someone like Rosa Parks in Montgomery bus just pops up. But as she said, she was inspired by the people in Clarendon. Reverend Delaine was inspired by the stories he had heard and his college professors and others, and his firm belief in the Bible. He wrote columns regularly for the AME church newsletters and things, and they are powerful stories that he looks to his faith as a way to challenge these unfair laws.
How did he even rise to prominence in the United States? From when he was just an ordinary boy, when did he rise to become an important figure fighting for equal right or fighting for justice for the African American people?
Well, he was actually just doing what he thought his job was as a leader in the community, as a minister and a school teacher, and his wife was a school teacher there as well. And as I said, remember, it starts with a simple request: give us gas. or a bus. We have bought the bus ourselves. And they refuse. So it moves from one step, but he's always fighting for justice and his belief in justice. And part of that is his theology, that is his faith, that he identifying both with the Israelites in Egypt and oppression, and also with Jesus Christ and the disinherited, as the great Howard Thurman theology wrote that. Excuse me just a minute more. Yeah, I lost my train of thought. My wife came in to bring me the book, which I wrote a book about Jesus and the dispossessed. The idea that Jesus was an outsider, dispossessed, like black people in the South, because the Roman Empire was he had no vote, could not vote, did not have the rights of citizenship. So Delaine studied this as well as a way for his inspiration to bring about these challenges. But it was also his community that was pushing him. I didn't even tell you about the first case when he got a plaintiff, Mr. Pearson, who was a farmer, so he had his own land, but his children went to school in one district because this was a rural area, so it wasn't very clear, but his children went to one school, but he paid property taxes in another tax district. So they used that to stop that case and tried to make fun of him, not knowing where, the school district were. But he was a courageous man as well. Briggs and those 170 people, wives and husbands who signed those petitions and became plaintiffs in the case, were extraordinarily committed. And they fought it with Reverend Delaine all the way through to the end, when, of course, Thurgood Marshall wins the case in the Supreme Court. And remember, it's a unanimous case that overturns a law that has said since 1896 that separate but equal was perfectly okay, except there was, of course, never any equal, always separate. And those laws, we forget about this though, those laws said that black and white could not be together. They separated them. So how could black and white work together if they are segregated by law?
But those laws now, what happened to them? Are they still in existence today? Are they still have they been inherited, modified, changed, renovated? What happened to them?
Well, the schools, one of the things that happens is tragic is when the schools were finally integrated. And of course, that took another 1970. The case was decided in 1954 before South Carolina schools actually used the law to delay integrating the schools. So that's still an issue today. All of the different private academies that were set up for whites, where you pay money to go to school, and then the states always tried to find ways to help them. But they did get, I didn't finish the story of James Burns, who I said was on the Supreme Court. FDR then makes him the domestic czar during World War II, and then he becomes Secretary of State under Harry Truman. So he is a very accomplished politician, statesman, known worldwide. He comes back to South Carolina for one reason: to fight against this Clarendon County court case, that is, to fight to maintain segregation and white supremacy. And of course, there is a statue of him, grounds, celebrating him. And I think we ought to have a statue of Reverend Delaine sitting right across from James Burns, Governor Burns, because he beat him in the court. But one of the things that Burns did before the case was finished is set a first state tax, income tax, which they used to build black schools at the time. So in 1953, before the final decision, they said, look, we are building the school. Burns also got the greatest lawyer, supposedly, in the United States. He'd actually run for president. He had won more cases and appeared more before the Supreme Court than any single lawyer. So he hired the best in the world to defend segregation. They really thought they were going to win. And who were they up against? Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP LDF. But once again, Thurgood Marshall brought the evidence there, and the court was receptive, and it was a unanimous decision to end segregation. And law took a long time. And even today, one of the things that's happened all those years since enslavement have been segregated housing patterns has also led to still segregated schools, though by law they're not segregated. They're really segregated by neighborhoods and where people live. And there were laws that kept Black people from living in certain areas. Um, and, I have just recently debated the Federalist Society on affirmative action. No one was upset, but there was a long period of affirmative action just for white people. And it goes way back to Social Security, the farm bills, all of that during the Depression. And Southern congressmen were able to get exceptions so that farm workers and domestics were not covered for Social Security. And so that then gave support for white people, but not Black people. In other words, they didn't say we're going to leave Black people out. They chose those professions that Black people were in and said those are excluded, just like they had done in the voting rights over and over. And then with World War II, you had things like the veterans benefits. And one of the things they could do is use a veterans loan to buy a home. Well, white veterans, like my wife's father, were able to buy a home in an area where the value appreciated. Black veterans were not able to buy this kind of homes, did not appreciate, and they did not have the equity in their home. So that, like my father-in-law was able to send his 4 children then on to college. You could also go to college on a veterans benefit. But that would mean if you were in South Carolina, like Harry Briggs and other Black veterans, you could not go to either the school I teach at now, Clemson, or the University of South Carolina, any other state school. All the schools were segregated. And while historically Black colleges, I love them, they're so important, and I'm glad they're making a comeback, but they did not have the resources and the networking that the schools did, in fact, like the University of South Carolina or Clemson here, same story throughout the American South. So you see how affirmative action just continued to discriminate against the patterns. And one of the things we look at today, whereas the wage gap has become much more narrow, it's not as bad. It's like 1.5 to 1. The wealth that one accumulates and is accumulated over time, which is the all, it's like 10 to 1 that whites have 10 times more than African Americans because of that important generational wealth that's been built up over time. For buying homes, and while we have segregated patterns and things of housing, you had covenants, you had redlining, which was the federal government and the state's government showing areas where they would not allow Black people to live or get loans. All of that contributed. It's the state itself, that is both the federal government and the state governments, are contributing to this generational wealth gap, how we can become. So it's all related in ways that it's just been very, very insidious, and people need to understand that. They will say, well, enslavement ended in 1865, but it's not just enslavement, it was generation after generation after generation of discrimination.
I'm sort of wondering, what kind of philosophy did Reverend Delay had? How would you describe his kind of philosophy? Like, how did he see the United States, both at the time that he was alive and in the future to come? How did he look at it? What kind of America did he wanted?
Well, he believed in the United States. He believed in those principles. He believed in all men are created equal, which is in the Declaration of Independence. And, I have argued before that the Declaration of Independence is America's mission statement. It was under Lincoln and after he died that we took the mission statement and put it in our rule book, the Constitution. And those were words that inspired, in fact, Reverend Delaine. It was an African American, Robert Smalls, who was elected in 1867 to the South Carolina State Convention in 1868, who put public education at all into, into South Carolina's Constitution. It became the first state to assure public education for Black and white students. And these kind of things inspired Reverend Delaine. The other thing was his theology. Again, his belief and faith that he was doing God's work, that God called him to stand up. And I think that's what gave him the incredible courage he had to face down all of these people all those years against incredible odds. When he went to New York, they also basically ran Judge Waring out of South Carolina too, the white judge who had ruled in his favor. In fact, when lightning struck to the house next door to him, the person put up a sign that said, "Dear God, he lives next door, not here," meaning that God should strike lightning next door. The white people really totally ostracized Judge Waring. They saw he was a traitor. The legislature passed a resolution that said they should put a plaque up to him in the Mule Barn at Clemson, joking about, and bought he and his Yankee wife 2 first-class tickets, airplane tickets out of South Carolina to never come back. Well, he moves to New York too, and he and Delaine, or Reverend Delaine, become good friends, and they were friends even before they even left South Carolina, both of them. So here are the 2 main actors, except for Thurgood Marshall and Harry Briggs, and they're both living in New York. Harry Briggs also had to go to New York to live. These people were not treated as heroes. They were treated as pariahs who had ruined, this sort of utopian white supremacist society for white people.
All right, this is many years ago. So today, how is Reverend Delaine seen in the United States? I mean, what do people think of him when they hear the name?
Well, many people don't know who he is. That was the point I was making about it. Everybody knows about Reverend Brown in Topeka, Kansas. That's the name of the case. But those that know realize what a hero he was and is today. And, I really think we need to put a statue on the State House ground. People learn their history not from the history books we historians write, or my grandchildren would have a much bigger educational fund. They learn it from what we tell them is important, that historic house, that little marker that says something historic. And no place is more important than the State House ground. And there is not I used to say there was not even one African American called out by name on the South Carolina State House ground, but Strom Thurmond's family actually added his African American daughter's name to his statue. But remember, he's also the person who ran on the Dixiecrat Party and for segregation for so long. But I think we need to put monuments on the State House ground of people like Reverend Delaine, like Congressman and Civil War hero Robert Smalls, like the great Black theologian that I mentioned earlier, Dr. Benjamin E. Mays, who were fearless advocates for the rights of equality and belief in the better angels of this country, as Abraham Lincoln defined it.
All right, you said something very important there, that Reverend Delaine, many people don't even remember him. They don't know who he is anymore. But this is not something that happened 1,000 years ago.
It happened in the end of 1940s through 1954, 55, 56. For instance, Clemson now has a Delaine Briggs Fellowship for students. And once a year, we have a big event. I have a good friend, Cecil Williams, who has created an African American museum, and we're centering a lot of things in that museum. Like he has the Bible of Harry Briggs and the Bible of Reverend Delaine, their family Bibles, and centering all of these sort of things. And I should say that it is Reverend Delaine's wife was just as brave. Maddie Delaine stuck with her husband the whole time and was just as courageous, knowing that they would probably lose everything, but fought for the rights of Black children to have a decent education. The other thing I would say is he believed in education. he had benefited from it. He believed, and I told the story about how as a young boy he fought off two white boys and actually hurt one of them, even though he was smaller than both of them and younger than both of them. But he was always courageous and took on bullies and others. So he was just always a courageous young man, and certainly an older courageous man. Joe Delaine Jr., who's now in Charlotte, where in fact Reverend Delaine came back to live, was a medic in Korea in an integrated unit that, as I mentioned earlier, Truman had integrated the military, particularly after the blinding of Isaac Woodard, all coming back to South Carolina stories, and had no idea any of this was happening. And when they shipped him home, he thought he was coming back to South Carolina. They sent him to New York because that's where his family was. He never knew that his father was being shot at and house burnt, all of that sort of thing going on. He was serving his country in Korea as a medic. 3 children, and this affected all of them as well, their children.
What worries me is that the incident that we are referring to now of Reverend Delaine, it's not like it happened several thousands of years ago. It happened only a few years ago, and already Americans, public, already forgotten them. And so what this is leading me to actually is that, see, the other day I was interviewing a gentleman where we talked about the life and legacy of Freddie Douglass. Then at the point, because this is a series that we're actually doing on African diaspora, and of course people of Africa, try to look at the life and legacy of this individual who have shaped our history. So at the point I was asking this gentleman, in the United States, how much do people remember Freddie Douglass? Looking at the fact that he have fought for a better society, for the society that is equal for everybody. Freddie Douglass was not saying, let's kill the white people so that we can be the people in the United States. He was simply fighting for a better society for all. So in the same vein, I'm asking the same question of Reverend Delaine. Why is it that people are forgetting him? Is it because they are filtering history, choosing who to be in the history and choosing who not to be, even though these individuals have done everything they could to fight for a better society? I don't know what you want to say about that.
Well, I will say that people are learning now. There was no book. Frederick Douglass had written an autobiography. He himself, had a newspaper he published. So he was a more celebrated abolitionist and black leader, appointed, very important in the Republican Party after the Civil War, had government appointments, so better known. This story is just as important, maybe even more so ultimately for America, but it hasn't been told. Now, I've written about it in Justice Deferred. I've written about some articles about it, and I think people will learn about it. But the story has to be told. His daughter, Ophelia Delaine Goings, actually wrote a nice little biography of her father. And so, but we need to let people know about it. I think as they learn of this story, that they will appreciate him. But it's a battle, I think, to get this story out. People don't like to remember bad things. They don't like to remember that we were a segregated society by law that said blacks and whites could not work together, could not live together, could not marry one another, that you couldn't work in the mills, in the same mill together, had to be segregated. So people don't like to look at that rather not good side of who we were. But
All right, I'd like to ask you. I'd like to ask you something there, so that you can continue. When you say people don't like to remember the horrible past, you mean people in general, or the white people who have perpetrated this crime against the African American people? Because I want to believe that the children of African America whose parents have been hung on the tree, they want to know what happened to their parents. So I want you to clarify that part.
Well, I can't really speak to African Americans as well as I can to whites, but it's pretty clear why whites don't want to remember it, because of his It is our ancestors who did these horrible, horrible things. But there is some literature that suggests that there are a number of black people too who don't want to look back at the horrors of what happened. Now, there should not be that because it's not their fault at all. The fault lies with white people who did this. But, I can't really speak to why there's not the memory of that. We've just had this great, I hate to call it lynching, a lynching memorial, but that Brian Stevenson did in Montgomery, Alabama, to bring the idea of lynching and where it occurred, black and men and women at Montgomery, and that's bringing attention to that. There are a lot of people trying to do some things about it, and I hope that will continue. But I also see this story, this particular story of the Delaines, the Briggs, the Pearsons, and all those families there, all of them, it seems to me, are one of the great stories in American history that changed America probably more than almost anything. And we need to know these stories. It's actually an inspiring story when you look at it. He was never bitter. Reverend Delaine was never bitter. I don't know how he kept from being bitter. Never lost hope in the United States. He was proud of being here. Harry Briggs, the veteran, was proud of his country. He fought for his country and tried to see those better angels that Lincoln talked about and to live them out in their lives. Here's the picture of their home burned down, and that's the Delaine family. And that's his home. And that's the three children and Mr. and Miss Delaine. About which
About
story?
the house that is burned down, because you are showing me in the picture now. Tell me what you write about that.
Yeah, well, I wrote about how it happened and how nothing was done about it. Same thing about the church. And this was not uncommon. In fact, even, not that long ago, there were a lot of church burnings. In fact, the early Klan of the 1865-66, they attacked churches and burned them in schools long before they were going after black voters, because they saw that as a way that would be challenging white supremacy. But this was not uncommon. That happened to so many people.
You were saying something about the church burning. Was it something that was happening all across the United States or in Carolina?
Both over the years. There was a spate of them, as I remember, in the 1980s and maybe 70s of churches and crosses. And of course, you might remember that it was 2015 when the white supremacist young man, Dylan Roof, walked into the black church in Charleston, Mother Emanuel's, and killed 9 worshipers. That churches have been targets of white supremacy. I think there's a reason for that too, and that is those churches give hope.
Thank you so much for that. Now, talking of Reverend Delaine, looking at him today, what would you say his main legacy? What do you think people should remember him for as an American?
Well, I think he is the person most responsible for bringing the end legally to separate but equal laws that reinforced discrimination, kept blacks and whites apart, and kept African Americans particularly from having opportunities for education. But that is the law that also becomes the basis of the Civil Rights Act that, as I began with, opened up all the opportunities of equal rights under the law, enforcing the 14th Amendment again, which has sort of been lost over the years in the courts as they sort of stripped away those rights. You've got to remember that 80% of cases for the 14th Amendment were for corporations, not for the people the 14th Amendment was clearly written for, and that is those who had been formerly enslaved.
Thank you for that. I thank you for the time and the sharing. Now, to conclude the conversation, what would you like to say?
I can just say he's one of my personal heroes. I think people need to know this story. And also to know that despite the personal things that happened to him, he is this key spark plug that led to the court case that ended separate but equal and opened up the United States to make it a better place, particularly in the former Confederate states and those southern states. Not only that, he was a wonderful father and family man and friend, committed, and people were committed to him. It shows the strength. The story shows the strength of that community in this rural South Carolina community. We think that most things happen in cities where there's huge numbers. There's no anonymity in these little white communities. Every white person knew who the black people were who were protesting. They brought all kind of pressure on black people to not be part of this court case. I didn't get into it. There's also a young man, a high school student, who was president of the student body, and he stood up against a corrupt, in this case, black principal who was doing the duty and the work of the white community. And they altered his transcript. He had all A's, and they gave him others when he had a full scholarship to go to college. It cost him his opportunity for a college scholarship. And this was done within the black community, the divisions there, for a black school superintendent who was working with the white community to try to stop the protests of black protesters. It was not all a unified community.
Thank you. That is an important conversation that, of course, we have on another occasion. So thank you so much. I appreciate the conversation and also the time that you spent here.
It's always, I really appreciate what you do. These stories are important. People need to know their history. Both black and white need to know their history. And remember, it is a white judge who pushes this from being let's have equal schools to let's get rid of segregation, at least legally. But there are other, as we talked about, there were other ways to maintain segregation. One quick story, James Burns as governor, I found a letter, his papers here at Clemson. He said, even if we lose the case because of residential patterns, we can continue to keep the schools segregated.
Anyway, that is where we are going to leave it today. With me, that it is not over. It's a continuous struggle for a better country, the United States.
Reverend Delaine, they tried to buy him off. They tried it, but he didn't. He cared about his community and the next generation and fighting for the children of the next generation. He could have been fine, but he stayed the course, refused to be bribed, refused to be intimidated. And he changed America. And we need people to understand that there are people like Reverend Delaine that we can emulate, that he is a true hero. And a hero that needs to be recognized, as I said, on the State House grounds of South Carolina and other places.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you for the info. If you enjoy this podcast, make sure you subscribe so you never miss any of our future episodes. Rate and review Obehi Podcast and share with your friends who might need it. I remain Obehi Ewafo. Thank you so much for listening and talk to you in the next episode.